Welcome. You've heard the introductions. I should only add to them that Alan Dershowitz's prolificity with books is such that between the time this discussion starts and the time it finishes, there will be a book about it. All right. I don't have to set the scene, I think, for longer than 30 seconds. The only thing that occurs to me is if you grew up at the time I did, in this town, in this country, you have one perception of the growing acceptance of what it means to be Jewish and the shrinking of real anti-Semitism into the darkest corners. Mm-hmm. The latest poll I saw, when asked, would you vote for a Jew for president, the people who said no are down to like 2%. If you look abroad, the picture's not quite so sanguine. The reason I want to begin with you, Deborah, is you did indeed just get back from this conference in Berlin. I read, she wrote a piece in the foreword, if you want to check it out online. I'm going to ask you to kind of summarize this for us because it was a pretty chilling thing to read.
Yeah, well, if you've been to one of these international conferences, which I know both of you have, much of the time is spent with official pronouncements, official delegations making their state announcements, and that was a good part of this conference. But first of all, there was already a difference when you looked at who was there. When the leader of the White House delegation, of which I was part, was led by Ambassador Samantha Power, and she made this point very undiplomatically in her opening remarks, that 10 years ago when they had this conference in 2004 on anti-Semitism, when the OSCE sponsored it, there were 58 nations present, of which 1/3 were led by ministers or cabinet-level people. This time, even though for many of the people in this room, our perception of anti-Semitism is that it's gotten worse in the past decade, there were 38 countries represented, of whom I think 6, including our own, were led by cabinet level or ministers. And as Ambassador Powers said, when governments show up, people listen. When they send a cabinet-level minister, it's a telegraphing a message. And I was very pleased, actually, irrespective of what people may think of the current administration, they clearly took it very seriously. There were 3 ambassadors, head of a White House office, a State Department envoy, myself, and Abe Foxman. And there was disturbing things at the conference, but at the very end, the White House delegation and other members of the American delegation met with representatives of various Jewish communities. And some were quite young, maybe in their 30s, and I think around the table were represented France, Belgium, Spain, Russia, the Netherlands, Germany, and a couple of others. And the bottom line was they talked about the fact, I figured they would talk about the demonstrations, the terrible rhetoric we heard this summer, Jews to the gas and things like that. They acknowledged that was awful, and they acknowledged that there was a real uptick, and that's maybe too gentle a word, in the level of these demonstrations. But what they talked about was the change in their daily routine, the change in their personal lives. The young woman who was the head of the European Union of Jewish Students based in Brussels, talked about the number of university students who are just choosing not to affiliate. Because openly affiliating with the Union of Jewish Students means living a difficult life on campus, being criticized, having to defend Israel, et cetera, and fight anti-Semitism. The young man from France said that all of his friends were talking about leaving.
Leaving?
Yes. He didn't say, he said they won't all leave. But some of them will leave. Some of them will leave to Israel. Some will leave to other places, especially if they have family connections or can get visas and permission to go to the United States, go to Canada, go to Australia. And he estimated that a goodly number of them will leave to those places and won't live as Jews. They'll just go underground as Jews.
You said this was a meeting with the U.S. delegation.
Yes.
People. I guess maybe a more urgent question is, did any of the other nations, particularly the European nations, meet with these communities? And
not that I know of, but the White House and Ambassador Power was very anxious for us to meet with them.
One more thing, if I may. In terms of both the stuff we know about, the demonstrations, the killings, the threats, and what you've discovered, this chill that's run through Jewish communities, do you have any sense that the power brokers in these countries know of this and are responding, by which I mean either the governments or the media?
Well, the heads of state, Chancellor Merkel has made a very strong statement. Hollande in France, Valls also in France has made a very strong statement. Cameron made a strong statement in the UK. There's been strong statements from the heads. The question is, and I heard this privately from a number of the people in the delegations, is how far down that translates. It's one thing for Chancellor Merkel to make this compelling statement at the Brandenburg Gate, where she participated in a rally against anti-Semitism, and she usually doesn't go to rallies, so this was an exception to the rule. But how far down is it translating? And in France, you know, someone told me they had been at the home, the State Department envoy, Ira Foreman, mentioned he had been at the home a few weeks ago for Friday night dinner at the home of the head of the Jewish community in France. He said the guy lives in a very nice neighborhood. When he left the Friday night dinner, he was cautioned by other French people there, take off your kippah when you walk back to the hotel. It's safer that way.
Now, Alan, there was, in your book, there was one thing that jumped out at me for the purposes of the conversation tonight, because clearly we're going to get into a lot of how much of this is people's response to Israel. Okay. But you write, with your normal directness, that some of this, what's going on in Europe, is in fact, in your view, rooted in very old anti-Semitic viruses that I guess precede the creation of the State of Israel. Can you, why do you, on the surface it doesn't look that way. Why do you think that?
Well, I think it's important to understand a number of things. This is not the 1930s. Let's be very, very clear about that, and we'll get into that for a lot of reasons. Second, there are three distinct strains of anti-Semitism that are emerging in Europe. One, which we see in particularly Greece and Hungary, are the old-fashioned fascist anti-Semites who are neo-Nazi parties. And they hate the Muslims more than they hate the Jews. But that's the least worrisome form of anti-Semitism. It's old. We know how to deal with that. It's discredited.
Let me just interrupt. Yeah. I was in Hungary some years ago when the first signs of this, the cosmopolitans, you know.
Right, sure.
So why is it not that? Why is it less worrisome to you if, in fact, some of these people are in important positions in the governments? Because
it's discredited around the world, and you won't get any academics supporting it. You won't get decent people around the world really supporting it. The second is more difficult, and that is Islamic extremist anti-Semitism, and that's a matter of degree. You get Hamas anti-Semitism. The charter says, basically, Jews caused all the problems of the world. It could be the protocols of the elders of Zion. And then you get a woman like Judith Butler, a Jewish gay woman from Berkeley, who says Hamas is a progressive organization and all progressives should support Hamas. And the violence comes mostly from the second form of anti-Semitism, Islamic extremist anti-Semitism. A lot of them young kids, a lot of them unemployed, a lot of them based on kind of stereotyping Jews and scapegoating Jews. The third is the most dangerous, and that is the newest form of hard left anti-Zionism, which in some areas has morphed into a kind of anti-Semitism, and a unique kind, because much of it is generated by Jews, by people like Norman Finkelstein, by people like Gilad Atzmon in England, who was a Holocaust denier, hard to identify him as right or left. And it's when these three coalesce, and they coalesce particularly in places like France, which have large populations of Muslims and also a very, very important elite academic group, and a few neo-fascists. But the interesting thing, of course, in France is Le Pen is trying hard to come closer to the Jews and getting some Jews to support her. This is the
daughter we're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's one of the, because the father did have some of those strains.
That's right.
Okay.
And the daughter understands. She is a modern bigot who understands that, you know, you're much better off if you can direct your attention against the Muslims and not so much against the Jews who are in power. Okay,
so this is now, this is to both of you. As I say, I'll try to bring you both out of your shell. I think I'll be okay.
It's going to be hard.
But just, again, just to, this, I regard this as setting a kind of a groundwork. Is there a distinction in either of your minds between very strong objections to Israeli policies, Israeli leadership, Israeli actions, and anti-Semitism.
Of course, of course.
And if that is the case, now that comes the trickier part, how do we know when the one is morphing into another? Do either of you have, like, I'm serious about this, like a checklist, a test to say, okay, this person really, really doesn't like what Israel is doing, and really, maybe he doesn't want it to be a Jewish, I don't know, a Jewish state. Maybe it should be a, you know, one of the old dreams of a
binational.
Yeah, binational. Thank you. So when does the one, in your view, become?
You know, on one hand, you could say, you know, was it Potter Stewart who said, "I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it"? I would argue that the two of us, and certainly many people in this audience, we know it when we see it.
But there are some people who see it, and they see it too frequently. I mean,
Yes.
let me just stop and say, Samantha Powers, when she was nominated to be our representative to the UN, some extreme right-wing Jews, the kind who boo me at the Jerusalem Post conference because I favor a two-state solution, called Samantha Powers an anti-Semite.
Yeah, now that's ridiculous.
Which was horrible.
That kind of stuff
And,
is
you know,
ridiculous. And to echo what you said, to say that this is a Holocaust or this is 1939, even 1933 is not correct.
Absolutely.
Because you have the heads of states condemning it.
By the way, Samantha Powers' husband, Cass Sunstein, would be very surprised to learn that she's a real anti-Semite.
You know, she was my student. We were very close when she was a student at Harvard. There's just not an ounce of that in her.
But people will fall back on that kind of thing and charging anti-Semitism. Let me say, one ground rule, I think, in assessing anti-Semitism is how important it is that we get it exactly right.
Sure.
That we don't say, oh my God, you know, here it is 1939, or we don't say, oh, it's no big deal. If only they solved everything in the Middle East, it would go away.
Stop right there. That's because I don't mean stop. I mean continue after I ask you what.
I rarely stop when people tell me to, so, you know.
Unlike me.
But it's not stop and frisk you'll be happy.
No.
Okay. Okay. That's the question, or a question. Because one hears this. So if by some miracle, the contending forces in the Middle East, I don't know, I was going to say have a come to Jesus moment. That is exactly the wrong phrase.
Right, but we...
We'll take any help we can get.
Right. But if they...
He was Jewish.
But if they... That's... We're not going there. But if somehow, you know, the equivalent of the Ireland peace agreement happened, or the Rwandan peace happened, what happens to anti-Semitism in Europe then?
It's so embedded that it doesn't go away. I don't think it goes away. I think it lessens. I think it's ratcheted down to a certain degree, but I think it's very much there. And since, you know, I don't know, I wouldn't say whistling Dixie, because where I come from that has different implications, but, you know, I don't see a resolution coming in the near future. And I think what we've seen is, and by the way, when we talk about Muslims, and I know, Alan, you know this well, we're not talking about people who have moved to France from Algeria. By and large now, these are young people, or youngish people, who've been born in France or born in Germany. And they have learned to adopt the rhetoric of anti-Semitism.
The European rhetoric.
The European rhetoric of anti-Semitism, absolutely.
Killing Christians for Passover matzahs and stuff?
Well, you know, Gilad Atzmon, a Jew, basically says that's a plausible theory, and you get some of that. Certainly by state-sponsored, Syrian, Egyptian even, and Jordanian and Palestinian. You get that on Islamic television.
I'm trying to understand this, and I realize I'm talking about an unlikely hypothetical, but I think it helps illustrate the link.
No, I agree.
Okay, if the Middle East becomes peaceful somehow, where does the fuel for anti-Semitism, say, in Europe come from?
Well, let me tell you where it comes from. First of all, it depends on the solution. If you have a two-state solution and the Palestinian Authority agrees that they will have some land swaps, basically essentially based on 67 with land swaps, and you know, the kind of thing that Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert offered the Palestinians gets accepted, what that does is it probably destroys the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, sanction movement. It moves students in academic centers who are marginally anti-Israel away, but the very hard left will continue this as long as Israel continues to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people, which brings us, of course,
Well,
to
we're going to get there.
the
believe me.
statute that was passed by the Knesset today.
But so your notion here is that even if the contending forces,
Right.
I grant you again that I'm dealing in what may be a fantasy, although
Could happen.
you know, I was in South Africa in 1985 and said it'll never change. 5 years later, I went back and, okay. So if that happened, you still think there'd be an element of the hard
yes.
left
Yeah.
that in effect says Hamas sold out?
Well, yes, and remember, as many people have said, thank God Israel has to make peace with the Palestinians, not with professors at Berkeley and Columbia, because they are far more radical than the people themselves who are contending forces. Remember that Edward Said, who was supposed to be the great guru of, academia, he quit the PLO when they signed the Oslo Accords because he did not favor a two-state solution. And he was regarded as a moderate on the campus. And I am regarded as a Zio-fascist on the campuses. Even though I support a two-state solution, I'm against the continuation of settlement building, and I'm basically a center-leftist on Israeli political scheme. But here on American campuses, I'm a Zio-fascist because I believe in Israel's right to exist as the nation-state of the Jewish people.
One of the things that also makes me think that it's not going to go away, and this I heard from the people at the conference, the representatives of the different communities, is that many of them, a number of them said this. We've been part of human rights coalitions for years. When there have been human rights abuses, we've always spoken out with other groups. When we turn to these other groups, these human rights groups, and ask them for support and say, look, it's anti-Semitism, always, they said consistently, they will say to us, oh, it's only words, or it's not really anti-Semitism, if only Israel would solve everything, it would go away. And they feel this is what broke this is one of the things that broke my heart, is how alone they feel. Yeah. How alone they feel, these European Jews. So yes, the tensions in the Middle East will always ratchet up, but they're there anyway. And you have Muslims, being the most overt in their protests, French citizens of France who are Muslim citizens, Germany who are Muslims. But then you have this vast array of silence from the cultural elites, from the playwrights, from the intellectuals, from the professors, people who you think would be appalled by the notion that sections of Europe will become Judenrein.
Why are you saying they're silent? You get Stephen Hawking's, who participates in the BDS movement.
Right.
That's not
BDS, but they
silence.
But they would think, oh, I'm against anti-Semitism. If you ask them, they would say, I'm against anti-Semitism.
But then if you ask them, how come you're not in favor of boycotting, and then you name the 100 other countries that have far, 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 far worse human rights problems, they say, you're changing the subject now. We're talking about Israel. Okay.
So you I find in that a certain double standard, and it's not just about Israel, but it comes to a certain, even amongst Jews, they're impatient with Jews, they're intolerant when it comes to Jew hatred.
Well, look, I don't know how far back this tendency goes, and in the academic community, at least as far back as, the useful idiots Lenin talked about who thought Stalin was a misunderstood progressive. I mean, that may be a trope that is beyond anti-Semitism. But I just want to put this out. You may have disposed of it most of the way, but one of the arguments goes like this. Look, all we're saying, we meaning the critics of Israel, is in fact, we're saying less hostile things about Israel than major media outlets in Israel and major elements of political opposition and authors who've written that Israel has lost its soul. So why do we have to be labeled anti-Semites when basically we're echoing the same things that Jews in Israel?
Because in Israel there's no such thing as a domestic dispute. Every domestic dispute becomes internationalized. So, for example, the New York Times runs a big story today about how important it is for Jews who convert to Judaism to be welcome. I think everybody in this room would support that.
It's an opinion.
But that becomes an issue Israel is having a debate about whether certain rabbis or other rabbis can do the conversion. That becomes an international story. Israel declaring itself to be the nation state of the Jewish people, that becomes an international story. So every conflict within Israel, every editorial in Haaretz, and one of the answers, of course criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. If it were, the highest concentration of anti-Semites in the world would live in Tel Aviv, and their Dishterma would be Haaretz. Right. So criticism of Israel is a good thing. Criticism of Israeli policies is a good thing. Criticism of Israeli leaders is a good thing, just like criticism of American leaders' policies is a good thing. But it's the double standard, the demonization, the delegitimation, the treatment of Israel as the Jew among nations. Remember the old ad on TV that had, this is your brain, it had a brain. And then this is your brain on drugs, and it has scrambled egg. This is your brain on Jews. Whenever you start talking about Jews or the nation state of the Jewish people, people's brains get scattered. They don't think logically and rationally. It's not the criticism of Israel. It's comparing it to Nazi Germany. It's saying it's the worst human rights offender in the world. No rational human being can believe that.
So, you anticipate me, but this is where we're going now. So, because I would assume for both of you, I don't think I have to assume, nothing is more outrageous than the notion that it's the Gestapo or it's the apartheid regime.
Right.
Okay, the Golds, okay. So now we come to the story of what the cabinet did on Sunday in Israel and what the Knesset, I guess, in a form approved today, which is to declare, I guess that's right, Israel as the Jewish nation.
Nation state of the Jewish people.
State of,
very
that was the
carefully
amendment.
Formulated.
Okay. The description of which, or in the New York Times, I'm sure we'll hear about the New York Times, was, among other things, to no longer treat Arabic as an official language, but as a special.
That's been changed in the Knesset bill, so that's been eliminated as far as I know.
Okay.
Just to explain a little background, the cabinet made a very political decision to recommend a bill, which was a harsh bill. Netanyahu immediately announced that the cabinet bill would not be accepted and would not be validated. That was an opening gambit, and then there would be discussion and negotiation, and much of what was in the cabinet bill was supposed to be taken out of the Knesset bill. I haven't seen the final bill, but the Arabic language was Arabic.
Even so, Alan, and here
I'm
may
not
be a
supporting
little...
it.
The whole idea of such a bill, and I believe Israel's a Jewish state. I mean, I have to belabor that point. But the whole idea of such a bill does nothing, and it maybe now the way it's worded is better, but fuel the impression of an intolerant state, fuel the hostility. 20% of the citizens of Israel are Arabs.
Right.
It's like poking a stick in their eye.
Look, Israel does a lot of really stupid things.
This is...
And as does the United States of America and Great Britain and France. But when Israel does something stupid, it becomes a major international
But this is our
story.
stupid. This is our stupid.
Yeah.
So.
The quote, and this was a quote after the cabinet passed, so I don't know if this person, and you may know him, you may have dined with him, you may have written books with him, I don't know. But it's Bar Yosef, the president of the Jewish People Policy Institute, said of this that this, and this is why I'm bringing this up, may stain Israel in the eyes of the free world. And he added, by the way, distance diaspora Jews who was counted as supporters of the Zionist project. It's the first part that interests me, which is, so when either of you confront one of these apartheid proclaimers and you say, this is ridiculous, and somebody says, well, you guys just passed a bill that seems to define the Jewishness as more significant than anything else, and you've got 20% of your people who aren't. There was a Druze police officer just killed trying to defend that.
But almost every European country has been defined and has defined itself as Christian states or as Catholic states. Every single Arab country in the world defines itself as a Muslim state. The Palestinian Authority Constitution says that we are a Muslim state under the Sharia law. Nobody seems to notice that. Nobody seems to mention it. Now, the Israel Declaration of Independence does say Israel's the nation state of the Jewish people with equal rights for all of its residents. It struggles with that concept. Right. This was a domestic political dispute designed to strengthen the hand of one particular part of Likud over the other part of Likud.
But at a great cost.
Look, I think also destroying the houses of the terrorists. It may be just under law. It's stupid because it's so visual. Wouldn't it be better to confiscate the houses, to sell them, use the money then to give the widows and the orphans of the people who were killed? There's no visible picture there. It's a lease passing, you know, a contract passing.
On the
so
other
the
side
stupidity,
on the other
you're not
side
going to get me to deny that.
Mm-hmm.
I have often scratched my head and wondered what the Middle East would be like if the Palestinians had adopted Martin Luther King's approach. I think it would have made life much tougher for Israel.
Much tougher for Israel. Much tougher. If 10,000 Palestinians sort of sat down in the middle of Jerusalem, it would be, what would they do?
Here's the problem with that analysis. Martin Luther King was never offered the end of desegregation. The Palestinians have been offered their own state 1938, 1948, 1967, 1993, 2001, and 2007, and they've always said no. You don't have a lot of credibility when you march in favor of something you've been offered and rejected.
But the problem is, Alan, look, I agree with you 100%. I mean, every point you're making is a point we make at our Friday night dinner tables amongst our friends, and we say, what the heck is going on here? They've turned it down, they've turned it down, they've turned it down, and Israel ends up the bad guy. But thinking strategically,
that's what I'm getting at.
This is the problem. Yeah. That much of what we're seeing coming out of the government of the State of Israel, and this is the first time in my life that I have been publicly critical of the State of Israel.
Oh, I've been critical many times.
Let
me, I'm not going to try to defend it, but let me put a plausible explanation out there and see what you think of it.
Okay.
Here's what I think. I'm not quoting him. Here's what I think Benjamin Netanyahu would say if you got him privately in a room. He would say, look, I am a centrist, leaning toward the right, centrist leader, mostly right economic. I really want to see a two-state solution. I have the right wing closing in on me. I want to stay in power because if I don't stay in power, it's going to be Lieberman, it's going to be Bennett, it's going to be somebody who is much, much worse. And in order to stay in power, I have to know how to use the system politically. And every president, every prime minister does that, but when I do it, it becomes an international story. That's what he would say.
I want to introduce a second, I mean, it's on point, but go ahead.
But I just think he might say that, but I think we're at a decisive and not good moment. I mean, this is the state of world Jewry. It's not a good state of affairs. I saw that last week. We know it. We know it from so many other things. And I don't know that right now the government of Israel, certainly the prime minister of Israel, has the luxury to be playing these sort of political games because I think in the long run it hurts Israel and it may hurt segments of the Jewish community.
Assume you were right. He would say it's not a luxury. He would say if I don't play these games, Bennett and Lieberman come in, and isn't that much worse for Israel?
But here's what I think is a point we need to look at beyond the strategic calculations of Netanyahu and the fact that they got primaries in Israel too. We know what primaries do to political parties.
Right.
But I'm assuming both of you saw the David Remnick profile in the New Yorker last week, which really was an act of at least a fortuitous timing because we're here. If you haven't seen it, it's a profile of the new president of Israel, Ruvi Rivlin. Now, this is not exactly a Haaretz columnist. I mean, he is a one-stater. He's a Greater Jerusalem supporter. He's pro-settlement. But he also turns out to be increasingly vilified because he has been speaking out against things like violence against peace demonstrations, attacks on Arabs. And he said, and it's important that we understand, this is to these guys in some ways to the right of Netanyahu. But he says it is time to honestly admit that Israel is sick and that it is our duty to treat this illness, and by which he meant racism. Now, The reason I'm circling back on that is over the years, in 92nd Street, why has had people like so you've had ardent lovers of Israel writing lamentations about what has happened. You've apparently until now not been one of them because you haven't criticized. Is there something beyond the policy of the Israeli government, a strain of something growing in Israel that ought to be disturbing to its great supporters?
I think it's disturbing to many Israelis. It's disturbing to many Israelis who aren't on the political right. A sense of intolerance, religious intolerance, intolerance of Arabs, intolerance of converts. There's a right-wing shift, and I don't mean political, but it's what Rivlin, and maybe right-wing is the wrong term, it's what Rivlin is talking about. An upping of the or a feeling that, there's only one way, our way or the highway. And that's not the Israel I know. That's not the Israel I lived in for well over 2 years as a student. It's not the Israel I love. And I think it's not an Israel that has great hopes for the future.
But let's think of the reasons why that is. What was the greatest contribution? What was the greatest success of Zionism? The greatest success of Zionism was bringing 1 million Russian Jews out of oppression into Israel. That's what moved Israel to the right. For every good thing, there's a bad thing. What else? It turns out very religious people don't come to things like this. They stay at home, they have sex, and they have kids all the time.
I think they do some other things
okay,
too,
but they have a lot of kids, and we don't. And so when you put these two things together, Haredim multiplying, we decreasing, secular Jews in Israel have a birth rate that reduces the numbers, Haredim that increases. Russian Jews come in. As Bill Clinton once said, Israel, damn it, it's a democracy. And there's no such thing as the Israeli government. They don't act. There's a prime minister. He has a kitchen cabinet, a big cabinet. Then there's a Knesset, and there are voters. There's a free press. You can't tell Israel what to do. If you and I were the czars of Israel, and the reason that Rivlin thing is so unfair in some ways, he's the president of Israel. He doesn't have to run for re-election. He doesn't have to keep a coalition together. But if Bibi were the president of Israel, he'd be making very, very similar statements. Understand the complexity of Israel. And when you understand the complexity, you know that there are no simple solutions. Oh, if only Israel were the Israel we remember as a kid.
No,
it didn't have Russians,
but I'm
not
saying that. But you acknowledge, and
of course,
there's a strain, there's an intolerance, a growing intolerance that is disturbing, and I think it's time to acknowledge.
What do you do about it? What do you do about it? Do you send the Russians back?
No, of course not.
Do you impose birth control,
No.
So what do you do? How do you change Israel and make it a more liberal society?
I think it's time to speak out and acknowledge this and talk about this as a
And you think
problem.
the Haredim are going to listen to you?
No, the Haredim don't even know I exist.
Do you think the Russians are going to listen to you? There
No,
are
but I
two
think
Israels.
there's still some politicians.
Tel
To me,
Aviv.
no, they're not going to listen. But enough prominent diaspora Jews on whom they depend a great deal, enough of a groundswell of a critique, I think it will make it.
Look what's happening in America. We're growing more intolerant of immigration. We're growing more intolerant of many, many kinds of.
And I don't know what
it's a world trend.
This is actually an area I might feel
You
comfortable
can get a word
speaking
in,
in.
but-
No. I mean, as opposed to letting the folks who actually know about area and asking questions. American politics, I'll claim, I don't agree that we're growing more intolerant compared to like 50 or 60 years ago.
course not.
Please,
I'm talking
and I
about
don't just
20
mean in the South. You spent a lot of time in Boston. I don't have to remind you about what happened with busing in Boston in the 70s, or what happened here on issues about housing and schools. I mean, and that gets to my point. It may be an imperfect analogy because the United States was not surrounded by enemies bent on its destruction,
Right.
which is something worth keeping. But politicians in a free society, one of their obligations is not to roll with the intolerance, but to push back. And I think in that article about Rivlin was that's not what's going on. That this force, which is, I think the headline coming out of here is Dershowitz assails secular Jews for not having enough sex. That, I think, is
Not me.
My wife's in California, what can I tell you? But that more seriously, that it's not enough to say Netanyahu's under great pressure from the right. Because
leadership.
And the question there is, I mean, I'll give you one, I'll be really provocative. This notion about Israel as it's like the Nazis. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is contemptible.
I call it softcore Holocaust denial.
It's contemptible. But we remember who broke up rallies in the streets of Berlin in the late 1920s and early 30s. There's something about that.
Mm-hmm. I'd be very careful, Jeff, about going.
No, that's why I didn't. All I'm saying is it is a tactic that goes beyond just voting for conservative.
So who are the leaders? Who are the leaders? Let's look at what's going on in Europe. Every single European country has elected a conservative leader. Every single one of them. Okay. Merkel.
Holland?
Who? Holland. Well, he's
having his problems.
He's got his own Michigan.
Right. England. You look. There's a conservative trend. Well, look. Who are the heroes? Who are the people who stand up for principle?
Merkel.
Mostly, what they're called are former leaders, because if they don't reflect the views of their constituents, they get thrown out of office. Yeah, Israel has a terrible political system. It's far too sensitive to immediate needs. You can get elected to the Knesset with a very small number of votes. There are a lot of things that can be done to improve the system.
But I think
I don't blame the current leaders.
The system may be terrible. I think you get small parties that control and terrible coalitions and all that. But I think it's also time to say there's got to be a greater sense of leadership. It can't just be swaying to the political wings, passing this maybe improved bill. I haven't seen the final version.
I'm still be against it.
Yeah, it's still unnecessary. As I said earlier, a stick in the eye of other countries, exacerbation of the situation of European Jews.
And you think things would change? I mean, look, let's remember, it was only 15 years ago that Ehud Barak was the prime minister, and only 7 years ago, that Ehud Olmert was the prime minister. BDS movement started during their tenure, during their administration, not during the Netanyahu administration. Much of the trend we're seeing now began at a time when there were more progressive,
But it's being fueled now.
There's no question.
It's being fueled now. And we're going to see it on American college campuses. We are seeing it, and not just on Berkeley and not just in Michigan, but we're going to see it in other campuses. We're also going to see a sense of, Jewish students, traditional American Jewish students, coming to colleges, coming to universities, and saying, do I want to openly affiliate with the pro-Israel group? Do I want to even openly affiliate with Hillel or with this? It's just a can of worms. It's just unpleasant.
I'm sorry. I've got some good questions here from the audience.
Are you shutting me up? Is that what you...
Oh, yeah. That's going to happen. No, I'm going to give you a chance to talk more, but to other people.
Then I love it. Go ahead.
Interjecting one thing as a former political operative before I became a virgin. The thing I least understand about the response is what's in a lot of... Alan's book is essentially a collection of a lot of op-eds over the last 5 years. But one of the points he comes back to again and again, and I do not understand why this is not like the central point in defending Israel on campus, is what does Hamas and what do these groups stand for? I mean, you alluded to it at the beginning.
Where would you rather be gay?
Yeah, that's what I mean. You had a
in
wonderful
Gaza
thing in one
or in Tel Aviv?
Yeah,
Right.
you go here are 3 countries to go to and proclaim that I'm a gay person, I'm for abortion rights, and I don't know what the other one was. And then you can do that. And you want to do it in Tel Aviv? You want to do it in Ramallah? Would you like to do it in Tehran? Because this argument is the one to me that absolutely undercuts. The notion of...
It makes no sense, but I think what we're seeing on campus is, some students can be smart, you can be very smart and go to very good universities and also be completely dumb. But what we're seeing is a simple equation. the white people, quotation marks, oppressing the brown people. When that happens, the white people clearly have to be wrong, and certainly they're wrong because they have the tanks and they just have those rickety little missiles.
And tunnels.
I have lots more than that, but it's this colonial model that's imposed on the Middle East. Most of these kids couldn't find the Middle East if they had to look for it on a map.
No, they couldn't find.
They couldn't find Israel,
Illinois.
Right.
I mean,
that goes without saying. But they couldn't find it, yet they imply this sort of simplistic thing. So it's the battle is being lost, not to people who really understand the situation.
But what I mean is there is a strategic way to do this. Is like sign the Hamas petition, support the people that want to execute gay people and condemn women.
Let me tell you who the villains are on the college campuses in 30 seconds. They're not the pro-Palestine professors. They're not the vocal people who have the BDS. Some of them believe this. The villains are the pro-Israel, mostly Jewish professors who don't have the courage to speak their minds and to state what they really believe. The ones who call you and me and say, thank you so much for speaking up on behalf of Israel. But they don't have the guts because they don't want to have their student evaluations affected. These are people with tenure. After 50 years
these are also
of
the
teaching,
people who throw people off
I have never
campuses.
met a group of less courageous people than tenured professors.
And that's
Do
why
they know that there are two of them sitting up here?
And that's why Bill Buckley actually made a point when he said, I'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than the faculty of Harvard University. To which I said, damn right. But anyway, to questions. Let's see. Actually, you've answered a couple about what's happening on college campuses. But your reaction, I mean, both take it. Some of these are directed at you. But your reaction, Alan, to Secretary Kerry's blaming Israel for Islamic State's actions. Did he do that?
No, what he said was, and this has been a consistent trope, that if Israel were to make peace with the Palestinians, it would weaken ISIS's efforts to recruit. Total and look, I've known John Kerry since he's a young lawyer, and he's a terrific guy. I like him very much. His brother attends our synagogue, and his wife is the president of the synagogue. There's not an ounce of anti-Semitism in John Kerry, but he's just wrong. ISIS isn't recruiting based on whether Israel is building a few new settlements on the West Bank. It's recruiting, if at all, about Israel because Israel exists. And so there's nothing that Israel could do that would have any impact on ISIS recruiting. He's just dead wrong.
It's not only wrong, but the idea that it's disturbing that he would get into that mindset to say it. That's even more.
It's an interesting question. Does the U.S. support of anti-Semitic and neo-Nazi regimes such as Saudi Arabia and Ukraine worry you as it shows the lack of depth of U.S. concern on the issue?
Yeah, I wouldn't call. I mean, wouldn't want to live in Saudi Arabia as a woman. Certainly as a Jew, I wouldn't be allowed to live there. But I don't know that I'd call them neo-Nazi regime.
I mean, I think probably the neo-Nazi part is the Ukraine. Yeah, I'm just assuming that.
The Ukraine is such a mess. I wouldn't want to live in Russia either. So I think there's a certain realpolitik that I don't think. Let me put it this way in answering the question. I don't see our support of those regimes as emblematic of our lack of commitment to fighting anti-Semitism.
I think the last 10 years has taught us to appreciate authoritarian regimes that are stable.
I understand.
I think Franklin Roosevelt once asked why he was supporting, was it Batista? He's a son of a bitch. He said, yeah, but it's our son of a bitch.
Yeah.
And, we had our son of a bitch as the Shah, and Mubarak, and, maybe even Gaddafi, maybe even, I won't go as far as to say Assad, but the stable autocratic regimes.
Well, Saddam Hussein in the 80s.
Saddam Hussein in the 80s fighting Iran, right?
Although I do think that the level of Saudi support for the crazy people, as long as they don't hang out in Saudi Arabia,
the Saudis
and attacked us, is a problem there.
Well, look at Qatar.
Qatar
is
that's
also
exactly
supporting terrorist groups.
All right. Now you're supposed to be pundits here. What do you think is the possibility Israel will act unilaterally, militarily against Iran? And if Israel does, what are the military and political repercussions? You know.
Simple. I hope Israel does not act unilaterally against Iran. I think it would be a big mistake. I think there's that sort of, we should just go in and bomb them. I don't think the Iranians will sit there quietly if we do that. I have a lot of relatives and friends in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and Beersheba. You know, it's very easy for me to sit on the stage of the 92nd Street Y and go in and bomb them. They'll come. It won't be like it was when we bombed the Iraqi reactor, you know, that we came in, did it, and Israel came in, did it, and left. I think it'll be much more complicated, and there'd be a great loss.
I think the nightmare scenario that keeps me up at night is that the United States makes a deal with Iran. Wendy Sherman wins the Nobel Peace Prize. It becomes the signature accomplishment of the Obama administration. And Israeli intelligence on all sides say it's been left as a threshold nuclear state. It's only a matter of a year. And Israel is put to the choice of tolerating or accepting the possibility of an Iranian nuclear armed state with missiles capable of carrying nuclear weapons, or taking the very, very dangerous and risky path of attacking. And I hope it never is put to that choice. But if it ever had to do that and did it, imagine what it would do to American-Israeli relations and to relations between Israel and the rest of the world. And so it's very, very dangerous. You know, when Begin decided to bomb the Osiris reactor, he made a very interesting statement. He said, we can't count on deterrence because our Air Force would never accept an order from me to drop a nuclear bomb on Baghdad. Holocaust survivors cannot incinerate 1 million Iraqi children. He said, Israel cannot count on tit-for-tat deterrence. Therefore, we have to go for preemption and prevention, which attacks military targets. Iran is very different from Iraq, very different from Syria. We all hope it doesn't come to that.
Exactly.
When people point to the rhetoric and positions of Iran, I did a conversation with Henry Kissinger a few weeks ago, and his new book is unusually blunt about his fears about Iran. But the counter-argument I've heard Fareed Zakaria and other people make it is, look, you know, 45 years ago, China was saying a nuclear war is no big deal. As long as the people who survive are communists, we can lose 3 billion. And people said, this guy's crazy. And then things changed. And so his point was, Iran's not going to want to commit suicide, so maybe the kind of rhetoric that we hear out of them needs to be not taken.
I don't disagree with that, except Iran did send, nobody knows exactly how many, 50,000, 70,000, 100,000 of its own children carrying plastic tokens over mines and killed them, their own people. If there's ever been a nation that comes close to being a suicide nation, it is Iran. And remember what Rafsanjani, supposed to be the moderate, said a few years ago. He said, if we develop a nuclear bomb and attack Tel Aviv, we'll kill 3 million Jews. They will retaliate by dropping a bomb in Tehran, killing 10 million Muslims, but the trade-off would be worth it because we would have destroyed
But that Jewish sounds like what Mao was saying in the 1960s.
But when someone says, and especially when you're talking about Jews and you're talking about Israel, when someone says, we intend to wipe you off the face of the earth,
yeah, you have
good reason to pay attention and to believe. You know, one of the things, by the way, going back, linking this to our earlier conversation, is when Ahmadinejad used to appear at the UN, and he would say something akin to, I'm going to wipe, Walt and
Mearsheimer.
Yeah, Mearsheimer would disagree with this analysis, but he was pretty clear, I'm going to get rid of Israel. People would say ho-hum. But then he would say, I don't think the Holocaust happened, everybody would pay attention. Because that's sort of easy to disagree with. But when he said, I'm going to wipe, it's just rhetoric. You know, if I lived in that part of the world and someone said they were going to blow me up.
No, I understand. I'm not suggesting attention should be paid. Here, by the way, there's an interesting, you had mentioned that people might celebrate this as an Obama success. And there is a question here. Do you feel that Obama snubs Israel and that ignites anti-Semitism?
No.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm critical of, I'm not straight line, everything Obama does is great. I've been very critical and publicly critical on a number of things. I'm not sure it fuels anti-Semitism. I think when John Kerry, who is certainly is, and you know I don't know him. I've met him, but I certainly don't know him like you know him, Alan. When he says things like the situation in Israel fuels ISIS, that fuels a certain hostility towards Israel, which we see easily spills over into an anti-Semitism. So I think there have been instances where there's been a symmetry, you know, after Harno for things, well, too many Palestinians and too many Israelis have died. On the day that people, you know, we get so upset when ISIS beheads people, which we should. They came in with axes, and they beheaded people, and they cut off limbs. And it was sort of, you know, we saw how CNN covered it, attack on Jerusalem Mosque, you know, 2 Palestinians dead. It's like bombing you know, if you put up a picture of the World Trade Center and you say, you know, 19 Saudis die, I mean, that was the equivalent.
One of the worst things that the White House did this year was not to hold accountable those 2 people who made those statements about Netanyahu calling him a chicken bleep. That wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing was revealing classified intelligence assessment publicly, saying that Netanyahu was bluffing and would never attack Iran, and saying that the only reason Europe had sanctions because they believed Netanyahu would attack Iran, but now we're telling you Netanyahu was not going to attack Iran, so you can eliminate and reduce the sanctions. It was such a horrible thing, and for the White House not to immediately identify those folks, not through newspaper sources, I would never want to do that, but it's only one of 10 possible people who could have done it. The president could have called them in, could have found out who did it, and could have publicly fired them and clearly disassociated himself from those outrageous statements.
Well, I agree with that.
Okay. So, because I'm saying so because there's it flows a little bit. How can Israel change the world's perception that it is the aggressor and monster and learn the truth? Why doesn't it have better PR with the newspapers and TV? By the way, you have already given one of, I think, is the crucial things, which is it's not just white and brown, but Israel are the guys with the guns and the tanks and the planes.
And that's the perception, and it's a simplistic, it's stupid, but that's the perception that is given.
I always thought that this began a shift with the invasion of Lebanon, because it was the first time that we didn't see Jews as David surrounded by 8 Goliaths out to kill himself.
Remember the Dosh book after 1967, So Sorry We Won the War?
Yeah.
People like, you know, I hate to fall back on that trope, but I think it's true. It's a trope because it's...
There's one mechanical thing that can be done to improve Israel's public relations. That is, right now, public relations is run by the foreign ministry, and that's a political branch. It should be in the office of the president. It should be nonpartisan. It should be designed to make the 80% case for Israel, the case for Israel that almost everybody agrees with, not get into the controversies. It shouldn't be designed to protect Likud or Netanyahu or whoever the incumbent prime minister is. The public relations ought to be outside of politics. Now, it's still going to be a very tough sell because of the inherent problems that Israel has, even in relation to Iran, where it's not a David-Goliath situation. There's a new book that just came out, Josh Moravchik's book, about how David became Goliath, which makes the argument about what happened after the 67-73 wars to turn Israel into the superpower, defeating a small, you know, Palestinian unarmed group of people. Turning the Arab-Israel conflict into the Israel-Palestine conflict was a brilliant strategic measure. And I have to tell you, the Palestinians on campus are doing a much better job in making their case. They have the help of a lot of faculty, to be sure, than the pro-Israel groups are making their case.
But, you know, I think one of the other things is, we talk about PR, bills like those that was passed today, even in the improved form, don't help. They just add fuel to the fire, and they don't serve any purpose. And if you're at such a point where every little step counts so much, and every perception, and every loss of a professor, and every loss of a campus, or a loss of a trustee on a college board, how they're going to vote, counts, you don't have to add fuel to the fire.
So one of the questions which I tried to at least suggest, and you've had your own It's not an answer because you want the cowardly professors to be less cowardly. The question is, what is your recommendation for an effective and coordinated response to anti-Semitism on university campuses?
Well, it's very hard. Just one example. About a month ago, I was invited by Amnesty International's Columbia University chapter to give a lecture on human rights in the Middle East, and I enthusiastically accepted. When National Amnesty learned that I was invited, they rescinded the invitation. They said they didn't want somebody like me with my views on Israel, my views on human rights, my views on a range of subjects to be speaking under the auspices of Amnesty International. J Street will not allow me to speak to any of its groups. They want an open tent, but they close their own tent when it comes to have speakers. Last night, the American Zionist Organization, which I disagree with on so many issues, they are against the two-state solution, they are in favor of expanding the settlements, they invited me to speak to their group, and I gave a speech critical in some respects of them. Well, so I think we have to have more dialogue on college campuses. What's missing on university campuses is nuance. Professors, you can't believe tenured professors making the Nazi analogy, making it not only in the court outside of the classroom, but in the classroom itself. Now, you know, we don't want to go back to the bad old days of where we are taping professors and doing all of that. But obviously, we have to expose what's going on college campuses.
Let me give an example on a more benign level. We had an incident at Emory about a month and a half ago of a couple of swastikas being painted on the AEPI house. I thought it was in the middle of the night, everybody was sleeping. It was a Saturday night at 3 a.m., and the students laughed at me when I said, well, was everybody sleeping? You know, they were just getting started. And they painted a number of anti-Semitic slogans on the building. The guys in the house immediately went out and painted over the slogans and almost were about to paint over the swastikas when someone took a picture. The picture, of course, went viral. The story went viral. It broke early Sunday morning. By that evening, the president of Emory University, James Wagner, had sent out a strong letter decrying this incident, and he sent it out. It was sent out to everyone with an emory.edu mailbox. That's 42,000 people. Later that night, the student council put out a statement, why we are wearing blue. We are wearing blue supporting AEPI. We're wearing blue indicating our opposition to anti-Semitism. It has no place on Emory campus. The next day, the campus was awash in blue. People wearing blue. Every single student in my class wore blue. I even wore blue. I had more blue shoes. I didn't know I had them, but I found them, so I put them on.
But you know what? I mean, I think it's wonderful. I also think it's really easy.
It was easy. Yes, it's easy. It united, but it made the campus, as one of my students who happens to be non-Jewish, she identified herself when we were talking about it as such, said, if these people expected to divide the campus, they united.
Did you see the Berkeley experiment, though? There's a film, you can get it on YouTube.
Flag, yeah.
There's a kid, the same kid, and he's waving an ISIS flag. And he's saying to people passing by, join ISIS, join ISIS. ISIS is a great organization. You know, we'll take over ISIS. People walked by as if it was nothing. Then the same kid waved an Israeli flag. And you should see the horrible condemnation and attacks that he got from students just walking by.
Many of whom wouldn't know where to find Israel on a map.
Yeah. And that's, see, to me, you know, at least in terms of talking about this country and at least on college campuses, that's the essence of it. Is that Israel has come to stand for a uniquely evil place, which is, I would think, even for those of us that have real problems with what the government's doing, that's just, it's in the worst way astonishing.
Being a Jewish kid on college campus today is fine. If you're silent or you're anti-Zionist, you're in great shape. Being a Jew is not a disadvantage today on a university campus. It's not even like it was when you and I graduated law school and college. When I graduated law school, I was turned down by 32 out of 32 Wall Street firms. I had pretty good grades at Yale, and
you're that much older than I am.
And they said maybe it was how I dressed, but it was more than that. But that's changed completely.
Yeah, well, okay.
But if you are an overtly Zionist Jew or you wear a kippah on campus.
Not all campuses.
Not
Don't
all
overstate
campuses.
it. I think there are problems, but it's not, let me put it this way, it's not, to borrow Rosenzweigian approach, it's not yet.
How many, do you have, are you, either of you, I'm going to get to, we've got about 10 minutes left and I want to get to these questions, but are any of you aware, I mean, not in the sense of, do you know that of, for instance, Hillel chapters being vandalized, being assaulted? This is where I think we move into the next.
There have been a number of assaults on Jewish, traditionally Jewish fraternities. Primarily API and a number of other things.
CBT,
there have been some, but you know, again here, I don't want to overstate it because you hear people say the campus is a hotbed of anti-Semitism. It's not. That's simply not true, and it doesn't serve the purpose to inflame the situation.
Couple of quickies. Is the opera The Death of Klinghoffer anti-Semitic or just artistic expression? Should the Met be condemned for?
Well, I actually went to the opera and wrote a review of it. And I did not find it to be anti-Semitic. I found it to be too sympathetic to terrorism. I found the better music, the music that accompanied the Palestinian terrorists, was more beautiful, more Bachian. The music that accompanied the Jewish diaspora and the words. The Jews, they talked about Jews interested in possessions and in money and Haredim not letting Jews watch movies. It was unbalanced. At the very least, it created a moral equivalence in some ways. I like John Adams. I like his opera, Nixon in China. I didn't like this opera nearly as much, but I don't think it should be banned. I don't think people should stop contributing to the Metropolitan Opera. I think freedom of expression should be, if you didn't like the Klinghoffer opera, write a better opera, or respond to it, or write a review.
There's also a strategic question here, and it harkens back to the Mel Gibson film on the crucifixion. To some degree, and I'm not saying the opponents didn't have a right to protest. I think on this one, Rudy Giuliani got it right. They had every right to protest, but strategically, I think they turned it into a sold-out occasion.
They did. People gave it too. The
applause
was too enthusiastic, and people said they were enthusiastic because of the courage shown by the Metropolitan Opera. It does not take courage to show an anti-Israel opera.
Okay. Will right-wing Jews who foster new settlements in the West Bank allow a two-state solution?
Not if they can help it.
They can't help it. They will be, if Israel adopts a two-state solution, they will be given a choice to live in Palestine as emigres to a Palestinian state, but not as Israelis, or they will be forced to leave. Israel is a democratic state that enforces its mandates, as they did in Gaza. So I do think the major settlement blocks will be included in Israel as part of land swaps.
Okay.
But if they decide to go, or their rabbis say to them, stand up against the arm, it could get very messy.
It could get very
messy.
Number two, that Netanyahu has not really built outside of the security barrier. The areas, most of the places where the building is going on are areas that will remain part of Israel. Ma'ale Adumim, Gilo, those areas.
Do you think France and England will have a Muslim majority to dictate government policy?
I don't think they'll have a Muslim majority, but I think as the number of Muslims increases, there will be increased political sensitivity to those people who are voting.
Well, perfect example is Livingstone, the former mayor of London. So he put together a constituency. The constituency consisted of lots of Muslims, lots of labor union hard leftists, and he got himself, he's a jerk, but he got himself elected mayor of London. But then he got himself unelected mayor of London. So, you know, it's going to be that kind of thing, and coalition politics always produce strange bedfellows.
Do you want to suggest that the traditional people in England and France have more sex?
You have sex on your mind tonight, Jeff.
Could be the takeaway.
Your wife's away.
I know who introduced this one.
Let the record show that this is a conversation between the two
guys.
boys.
I don't think boys is really appropriate for the two of us anymore. I'm flattered.
Boy chicks. This question comes from Orlando, Florida. What needs to be done to stop terrorism at the Western Wall?
Well, I think that's a strong Israeli presence. I think it can be. Are they talking about the terrorism of the men against the women?
See, that's what's not clear, and that's what I wanted to ask. How you define that terrorism?
I don't know what
different.
They're talking about the terrorism that many of the women of the wall have been subjected to. Terrorism is too strong a term, but the assaults to some of them. Then I think that is a little more under control than used to be. But it's very important.
But I think just to answer the more general question, terrorism is spreading around the world because it works. Terrorism is rewarded. And democracies have not learned how to cope and deal with terrorism. And it's a tragedy, and it started a long, long time ago. And I think the reason the Palestinians today have a greater presence at the UN and greater support in the international community than, for example, the Kurds or the Tibetans or other groups is because they engaged in terrorism at the Olympics, hijacking airplanes, and the Western world gave in to their demands. They became kind of glorified because they were terrorists. When you compare the claims of the Palestinians to statehood to the claims of the Kurds, they're not even comparable in any way. I'm in favor of a two-state solution, but morally, the Palestinian claim, the Kurds never were offered statehood the way the Palestinians were 3 times. The Kurds don't generally use violence, and yet they are neglected by the world, and the Palestinians are adored by the world, despite the fact that they have come to prominence as the result largely of terrorism.
One last observation here, because Alan brought it up when he mentioned the Olympics. You know, this in 2012, at the London Olympics, you had the anniversary of the Munich massacre, and it would have been a perfect time to commemorate the Israelis who were murdered at the Olympics. And the IOC, not Muslim groups and not far-right groups, the International Olympic Committee refused to do so.
Excuse me, yes, but if you know the International Olympic Committee and its history, that is totally, they would have betrayed their tradition as a center of not only anti-Semitism,
but it was also
violent, horrible corruption.
Absolutely,
so
absolutely.
Why would you
but Jewish blood is cheap.
Yeah.
And having said that, let's give a shout out to Bob Costas, who went
Yes.
out of his way to
Absolutely.
emphasize that and to remind the world. And I wrote Bob a note that night and told him how much I appreciate what he did and how much I think
the network
we all
cut
do.
the commercial.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's a whole other story.
He did what he wanted.
That's your folks.
That's, yeah, that's like welcome to the club, you know. A spaceship has landed. We'll be back after this brief message from Viagra. Okay, we're at the end of our revels, but I wanted to give each of you a chance to respond to it's the kind of question I often ask at the end of a conversation like this. 10 years from now, this is supposed to be the state of world Jewry. 10 years from now, do you foresee or think rationally that things might be better 10 years from now? Or are you concerned that they're just going to be worse? Or we'll just muddle through?
You know, I started my op-ed in the Times this summer with the old Jewish joke, what's a Jewish telegram? Start worrying, letter follows. We Jews are, you know, if life were at a simple spectrum with joy at one end and oi at the other end, we're much more comfortable at the oi end. You know, we do much better on mourning than we do on Simchat Torah, rejoicing with the Torah. We're much more comfortable that way. There was a famous Jewish thinker, philosopher, Simon Ravidovich, who used to talk about the fact that, who wrote a very important article about the fact that this anticipation of bad helps us sort of prepare for the worst and not be surprised by it. So some could say that our sitting here and saying, oy vey, it's terrible, and dear me, the sky is really falling, is that syndrome. I tend to think now, and I've always been against those, I've always railed against those who say anti-Semitism is worse every year. You know, you go to shul, and every year the rabbi would say, anti-Semitism is worse than it's ever been, and next year it was worse than it's ever been, et cetera, et cetera. I think now this feels different. This feels different. we've seen a renaissance of Jewish life in the past 20, 30 years. Jewish day schools, kindergartens, resurgence of Hillel, Chabad on campus, Limud, so many different things, foundations involved in Jewish life, creative programs, the Wexner program, so many other programs in which people have learned to rejoice in their Jewish identity, to celebrate their Jewish identity. What I saw last week in Europe were young people who still celebrate their identity, but who worry about Jewish identity becoming something from which at least many of their friends are running from. So that makes me feel, and then what I see in Israel with the politicization and increased intolerance, not to speak about the political situation and the strategic situation, leaves me to be more worried than I've been before.
Well, first of all, I think a lot of the credit for Jewish strength and positive Jewish values really comes from you, Deborah. I mean, I think we all ought to owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude. You have written both about the worst and the best. I mean, you've taken your studies in the Holocaust and Eichmann, and you've also produced generations of students who really thrive on their Jewishness. So you have done a remarkable job as a model on college and university campuses.
Along with many others.
Well, but you have really been our leader in many ways.
Thank you.
So you started with ended with a Jewish joke. I'll have an Israeli joke. In Israel, they say a pessimist is somebody who says, "Oy, things are so bad they can't get any worse." An optimist is one who says, "Yes, they can." I'm an optimist in two ways. Things could get worse. They could get much, much better. I can say one of the worst developments that's happening in terms of the Israeli peace process is the Swedish government, the British Parliament, the Spanish government, some of the other governments now unilaterally recognizing Palestine as a state without demanding of them that they sit down and negotiate with Israel a resolution. It makes it much harder for Abbas to sit down and negotiate when the street tells him, look, you're winning at the UN, you're winning in Sweden, you're winning all over Europe. Why do we have to give up the right of return? Why do we have to give up our right to destroy Israel? The only way you're going to get a two-state solution is by hard negotiations, difficult and painful compromises, and Europe's not helping by telling Palestine they can get a free ride and they can get free statehood. So I'm worried about it. I think that everybody knows what a two-state solution would look like and how good it would be for both Israel and the Palestinians. It would help preserve Israel as both a democracy and the nation-state of the Jewish people, which is always going to be a challenge. It would allow Palestinians to live in their own homeland as free and independent people, hopefully at peace with Israel. Hamas will still be a great difficulty. And, you know, the pessimistic aspect of it is Hamas loses a war, they have over 2,000 casualties, their entire infrastructure is destroyed, and their popularity has gone up. That's not a good sign. If you go to Ramallah, life is really pretty good in Ramallah. The GNP is high, people have nice cars, they have nice homes, and yet they're voting for Hamas. And I think efforts to try to turn the Israel-Palestine conflict into a religious conflict makes it much more intractable and difficult. So, you know, I'm going to work hard in my remaining years for a two-state solution, for peace, and for a normalization of Israel, but I suspect that the three of us on the stage may not live long enough to see a complete, total peace in the Middle East. That's my great fear.
I can't say that we have left you
Laughing.
happy hearts as you
But they're
approach this
familiar with this.
Thanksgiving.
They know this feeling.
But it is in the great tradition of our people that you come to a thing, you think, and you leave and you go,
Oy.
oy, veis mir.
Let's eat.
Okay.
Okay.